So we're super excited today to have Oisin McKay, who's going to be talking about using ecology to help computer vision, which is a topic that I feel very strongly about. I think it's something that we've all really found time and time again that ecological problems are a great forcing function for us to face and deal with new challenges for computer vision. Oisin actually was a postdoc in Pietro's lab. And so when I started at Caltech, we actually started at the same time. And he was an incredible source of mentorship for me as I was navigating my first few years and basically learning all of the things you guys have been learning this week. How do I use SSH? What does it mean to find a GitHub repository and try to train a model? Now Oisin is a lecturer, which is basically the UK version of an assistant professor at University of Edinburgh. So he knows Alex, and he's been working on a bunch of ecological problems since even before he was a postdoc at Caltech. I think, Oisin, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe the first one was bioacoustic bat detection in London. In what park? In the Olympic Park in London. Good memory. In the Olympic Park, yeah. Which is actually still ongoing. They're still detecting bats using models that he trained about, I don't know, 6 years ago, Oisin? Yeah. So pretty cool. Anyway, I'm going to let you take it away, but I'm so happy that you're here.
That's cool. Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, for the kind introduction. So I can't see anyone, but I can see something now happening. Great. So if at any point, is that any better? Can you hear me, guys?
Yeah, great. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm happy, but that's going to work. Cool.
Great. Okay. Cool. So thanks, Sarah and Susan, for sorting out those technical issues. It's always part of Zoom calls. So yeah, it's great to be virtually invited. So it'd be obviously great to be there in person, but it's really cool to be part of this in some capacity. And I chatted a bit to Eli actually today, and it sounds like it's been a really cool learning experience, and there's a lot going on. So I hope you guys are getting a lot out of the week. So I'm going to talk a bit about, as Sarah said, how ecology can help computer vision. We often think of it the other way, how computer vision can help ecology, but I think that there's quite a complementary relationship that exists here. And so at any point, do feel free to kind of just shout or stop me. I can't see anyone, so maybe someone will just kind of have to come up to the computer and shout. But I'm very happy to take questions and so on if people do have any questions for me.
Yeah, I'll help facilitate that. So if you guys raise your hand, I'll keep an eye, and then we can just work through that.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, great. So I'm going to just quickly talk for a second about computer vision. So my background is computer vision and machine learning. As Sarah said, I was really fortunate to be a postdoc for a few years in Pietro's lab. And in a sense, computer vision is all about understanding images, or extracting information from images. And maybe many of you are already exposed to that, and maybe even during the week you've come across many of the kind of terminology I'll talk about, to set things up here. But for example, we've got problems like segmentation. So segmentation, we want to assign for each pixel in an image some kind of class that it is. So maybe it's a cat, or it's grass, or it's tree, or it's the sky, and so on. Alternatively, we might want to localize the object in the image, so say where it is, and maybe even say what it is. So classification, localization. I'm guessing a lot of the problems that you might be looking at this week would be classed as kind of classification problems. There's detection problems, so kind of related to localization, but we're trying to find the location of multiple instances and maybe even multiple different types of things in an image. And then there's also kind of instance segmentation, so basically saying where something is and exactly what pixels correspond to that thing. So these are kind of like a flavor of some of the kind of classic computer vision problems that people tackle, but there's a whole host of other things. And so in the computer vision community, we kind of like to keep our lives simple, and we like to work with kind of standardized tasks and benchmarks. So, different maybe from ecology, what you'll find is that everyone mostly works with the same kinds of data sets, and we're all striving and trying to basically improve the underlying models and algorithms and show that they can get better on those data sets. And the way that we do that now is, if you think of in the case of image classification, where we take an image as input and we're trying to predict what is in the image. Basically, we're using these big data sets to train the parameters of models like deep neural networks. And so I won't go into kind of the specifics, but you've probably heard of things like CNNs, or maybe even some of you have heard of transformers, but these are all different models that take these images as input and they spit out some output that you care about. And so again, in the case of classification, we're talking about some kind of distribution or prediction over the different possible classes. And so this is kind of graphically represented here as this histogram. So you could think that maybe there's a class associated with like a toad. So maybe there's a high probability that the model thinks it's a toad, and maybe it's also confused that it's a frog, but it knows it's not a giraffe, and it knows it's not a rhino. And so, like I said, we take these big data sets and we then train the parameters of this model at training time, and then at inference time, we can just run this thing as depicted here in a kind of a forward pass to get this prediction. So in computer vision, there's several different data sets and many different data sets that people use and work with, but oftentimes these data sets are slightly one step removed from kind of real world problems. And so this is a nice example, I think, of maybe some of the kind of artificial nature of the kinds of tasks that often are explored in computer vision. So this is a data set called ImageNet. It's a very popular computer vision classification data set. And there's a class here. So in ImageNet, there's 1,000 classes, but the class here is t-shirts. And so you can see that this is how t-shirts are depicted in ImageNet. And so this is quite different from t-shirts in the real world. There's quite a striking difference in how these things are depicted. And so if you're tasked with training or building a robot that can understand the visual world, and you're training on these types of images that you find on the internet, and you're deploying it in the real world, it's going to have a big difficulty generalizing. The other kinds of challenges that maybe are not well exhibited in these kinds of standardized data sets is the nature of the classification task itself. And so what I mean by that is that when data sets like ImageNet, we broadly have these kinds of coarse-grained classification tasks. So what I mean by that is we're trying to separate things like images of birds from dogs from oranges. So there's really not a lot of subtlety here in terms of like the types of birds or the types of dogs. And instead, we're just trying to separate these quite coarse concepts, or this coarse-grained classification. In contrast, you can imagine a kind of a fine-grained task. So in a fine-grained task, maybe you're trying to separate different breeds of dogs. And so in practice, many ecological tasks fall into this kind of fine-grained type problem. And so this led us a few years ago to start working with a group called iNaturalist. So I'm guessing many of you probably have heard of iNaturalist before. And if you haven't, iNaturalist is this really cool kind of citizen science platform where people come together and share kind of observations or images of the natural world. And the idea is that this is kind of a digital collection of biodiversity. And so I think it was about maybe 5 years ago or even more, Grant Van Horn, who was a PhD student along with Sarah in Pietro's lab, I started talking to iNaturalist, and we started wondering if we could, or how would we build computer vision models to help the community and iNaturalist automatically identify all the different plants and animal species that they upload from images. And so, this is the snapshot I took of iNaturalist from a few days ago, but you can see here, for example, there's 100 million different images of nearly 400,000 different species, and those have been taken by nearly 250,000 different people. So there's just phenomenal data of incredible kind of visual diversity and difficulty that's embedded in a data set like this, in a platform like this. And the core question again was, could we build a computer vision model that could classify those things? And again, just to give you a flavor, of what you could imagine this could look like, this will range from things like mammals, to plants, to all manner of kind of diverse things. And so over the years, we've basically created these like slices of the iNaturalist, the full bigger 100 million iNaturalist data set, into these kind of smaller chunks that we can put out to the computer vision community. And so this is the latest one, is the iNaturalist 2021 data set. And so this is a reduced set of species, so 10,000 species, and about 3 million training images and 50,000 validation images and so on. So, to some extent, this represents kind of like the larger scale of things. I think in reality, many of the data sets I'm sure that you guys will be working with will be much smaller in terms of the scale. But I think this is kind of an interesting testbed because it gives us a sense of like, what can computer vision do given the kind of best case scenario in terms of amount of data to train. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a bit about some of the projects that have arisen from these kinds of collaborations with groups like iNaturalist, and give you a sense of maybe the kinds of things that do seem to work well right now and the kinds of things that don't work well. And as always, this is not obviously my own work on my own. This is kind of a work of a whole bunch of people that we work with. And so I'll kind of flag all those people at the end of the talk. Okay, so what are the challenges of data sets like iNaturalist? One of the kinds of challenges, for example, is the real world is not very well behaved and balanced. So there's not, equal numbers of all the different things that you would like to be able to classify. Some things inherently are just going to be much more rare than others and harder to observe. And so while you might have a monarch butterfly, and so in a monarch butterfly, for example, we might have tens of thousands of examples. So in this plot here, what we're doing is we're showing different classes from the iNaturalist dataset sorted by the most common on the left to the most rare on the right, just for this little slice of one of our datasets. And this is from an older version of the dataset. And so you can see again that there's thousands of training examples. So higher up here means more of the of common things like monarchs. And if we all go all the way down to this, I always forget what this is. There's some kind of crazy bug from New Zealand that there's basically, a tiny amount of these in the data set. And so in some sense, we're tasking models with training from this huge imbalance and hoping that they're going to be able to deal with this kind of, much less optimal data property at test time. Okay, so what are the other kinds of challenges of these kinds of natural world tasks? So the other kinds of things is that there's, can be huge interclass variation. So within a class, and a class, for example, could be a species, there could be, different life stages, for example, of an organism. So you would have, for instance, a salamander that goes from being, larva to all the way to adult. And the model is tasked with basically classifying all these images as belonging to the same species, even though there's a huge kind of visual diversity exhibited here. The other problem is low interclass variation. So this is between classes or between species. And so here we have an example of two moths. So this is the kind of the fine-grained problem I mentioned. So we've got these two moths, and actually they're incredibly visually similar. And you need to perhaps be a kind of an expert to know that it's the particular patterning on the wing bands and whether they touch or not tells you what species they are. And so another issue with these data sets is the geographical bias. And so, for instance, on iNaturalist, it tends to have a bias kind of to North America, to Europe, and so on, Australia. And in practice, some of the most biodiverse regions in the world are not necessarily well represented. And so these are, again, going to be factors that are going to influence our models and our models' ability to generalize. In as much as they also are issues related to the kinds of species that we're going to have in the data sets. And there's these other challenges as well. So I didn't explain it in detail, but the way that it works on iNaturalist is you upload your images. So you take these photographs, you upload them, and then the community helps you decide what's actually present in the image. So they try and come to some consensus as to what species is present. And so inherently, there'll be some errors in that annotation pipeline. You also have challenges where you might have evidence of some species. So you will have like I think this is a marking of a hoof or something like that of some kind of deer perhaps. And so this is not necessarily enough information to tell you exactly what species it is. And yet the vision model is being kind of forced to make decisions based on these kind of suboptimal images. And then the other challenge you'll have is that you sometimes have multiple species. So you have a tree, you have a snake, and then you have the snake's lunch, I guess, that it's eating. And so, these images, again, are not always going to be as well behaved as you would like them to be. And so, while all these things together might seem like actual negative things, these are all actually quite important and useful and valuable for computer vision researchers, because this really allows us to kind of push the limits of what's possible in computer vision research. Okay, so, and some of the other reasons why this is particularly exciting to us, I think, is that, these data sets, again, they're grounded in a real world task. It's not like the kind of arbitrary t-shirt classification example I gave earlier on. This is, a task where there's a real community of people that really want to, that really are engaged in this and want this to work well and really could benefit from it. There's also an element of like, the images that are selected are kind of freer from the kind of selection biases that might normally occur when we prepare a data set. So in computer vision, we typically create a data set by collecting images from the internet, and that will have its own kind of issues and biases. But this is, potentially got less of those. These are images that are collected by people in the wild, and the hope would be that they are less, have less of those kind of problems. There's also other kind of practical things like the community on iNaturalist. They want that data to be out in the public and they want it to be used for research. So we have good licensing of it. And then the other thing that I touched on is that, if you actually make meaningful improvements in your machine learning computer vision models, you could actually hopefully impact this domain a lot. For example, if you had a really good classifier, you could really reduce the amount of time that it takes to help people understand what's in images, because it would be able to do it automatically. Great. So let's revisit the kind of classification problem. And so what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is talk about a project that Eli, actually probably many of you met Eli, that Eli and I worked on a few years ago on improving image classification by trying to take some insight from ecology. And so I'll get to that in a second. But again, what is the core problem here in classification? We have an image, and our goal is to predict the class or the species from that image. So, again, without getting into the details too much, you can think of this as we have some distribution, like a probability of each of the different classes. And we would like the probability to be high for the class that is the correct one. And just to give you a sense of, from this is from a few years ago now, and from these data sets, so of this INAT 2017, which had about 5,000 classes, these models were able to get 64% accuracy. So this is actually quite impressive, so 5,000 way classification, and we're getting it right 64% of the time. And so this is the kind of standard classification framing of it. But in practice, as a human expert, there's a lot more kind of cues that you would use, or information you would make use of to be able to determine or predict what's actually present in an image. For example, you might ask, where was that image taken? What time of the day? What time of the year? These are all things that would actually inform your prediction. And in practice, we kind of hamper our computer vision models by just forcing them to make these predictions just from the images alone. And so the task we set out to solve was, can we predict the class label, given that we have the image, but also some information like the location? And in practice, we can actually factorize that out into kind of two separate tasks. So the image classification task and the actual, what we call a spatial prior. So knowing where, what species are likely to be present in a given location. And if we can combine those two pieces of information, the hope or the intuition is that we can actually do better at determining what species is there than if we just use the image classifier on its own. So let me pause for a second. Does that broadly make sense, that intuition?
Yes.
Great. I'm glad, Sarah. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we do this. Okay, so what are the challenges here? So the challenges are that we have to train from what we call presence-only data. So some of you are probably familiar with kind of species distribution modeling in ecology. And there ultimately we're trying to estimate the distribution of different species from these kinds of observations that we get in the wild. But we often just get observations of where something is, not where it's not. So again, it's easier for someone on a naturalist to tell us where they've seen something than it is for them to tell us, I can definitively be sure that this thing is not present here. So it's a different type of data and harder to get. And again, there's going to be geographical biases. And also, because of these difficulties in collecting kind of complete data, it's going to be hard to evaluate this type of species distribution problem. Okay, so let's revisit this. Let's revisit this pipeline again. So we have our image classifier, and we have a distribution over the classes. But like I said, we've kind of changed the problem now because I'm going to assume that we also have access to where and when the photo was taken. Okay, so this, for example, is some kind of toad, maybe a photo taken in Spain. The core thing that we were trying to do is figure out how could we train a model, it's called a spatial temporal prior, that in its own right could predict what species were likely to be at a given location. So again, think of this kind of as a model that takes in information of where you are and what time of the year it is, and then it gives you a prediction of what species are likely. So, if I'm in Edinburgh, I'm not going to be seeing any zebras walking around on the streets and so on. If I'm in California, there's certain things that you're going to not see there that you'll see elsewhere. And so this kind of very common sense basic knowledge is a really strong signal to help you filter out potentially some confusing cases that the vision model alone can't do. And then the simple thing to do is that we can combine the outputs of these two things together. And so I guess from my perspective, actually, why I think this is kind of a fun problem is that this spatial temporal prior, this is really a kind of, to some extent, a kind of bread and butter problem in ecology. How do you estimate the spatial distribution or the presence of species from, you know, noisy and incomplete biodiversity records? And by being able to leverage insight from ecology, we've been able to kind of improve computer vision. So that for me is kind of a fun and satisfying thing. So let me talk. I'm not going to go into the details in the talk today, but you know, I can point you to the paper, and I'm very happy to kind of answer questions as well afterwards if there are questions about it. But just to give you a very kind of high-level overview of how we might actually train this particular model here. Let me spend a few minutes on that. So and so actually, there's a really nice review by Sarah and Eli and a few others that kind of touch on the problem if people are not too familiar with it. So again, we only have this presence data. So we only know where things are. We don't know where things are not, but we can make a very simple assumption that we can randomly generate information of where things are not. And that sounds like a bad thing to do, but in practice, there's enough structure in our presence of where things are that actually, if we're not systematically biasing it in terms of where it's not, we can still get a good training signal from that. And the other thing then that we do that's potentially quite different from how ecology thinks of this is that this model here, it's a kind of a single unified neural network, okay? So it's a neural network that takes in information about the location and time of year, and it predicts, it spits out this distribution over all the species that might be present at that location. This is quite different from what happens in ecology. In ecology, what you typically do is you take information like this, then you get all this other information like environmental information, like the average, you know, rainfall or maybe the altitude, all these other kind of environmental covariates, and then you'd separately train a model per species. And so there would be no kind of sharing information across species. And you know, if one of the kind of lessons of the kind of deep learning era, or the representation learning paradigms that we have, is that being able to leverage and share information across concepts actually is a very powerful way to uncover structure that might be in data. Okay, and so this is a kind of a more detailed thing, but I'll just gloss over it. This is a kind of another way of depicting the pipeline I just showed. So again, our goal is to predict the class given the image and the location. We can separate it out into these two parts, which is the image classifier, the top part here, and then this spatial prior, which is the thing that I just talked about, which is a neural network that basically learns to, in some sense, extract some features describing a given location, which we can then multiply by features that we learn for each individual species, and then this tells us something about the likelihood that given species are present. So again, don't worry too much about the details here, but just the main thing to take across, to get out of this, is that in effect we learn some kind of representation of space and time, and we learn some kind of representation of species, and when we combine those two things, we can actually come up with a prediction of whether a species is likely to be at a given location. Okay, so let's revisit the classification problem. So here, if we talked about just the accuracy we had before, which was just the accuracy of the vision model, so what I said, something like 64%. When we combine this with our spatial prior, so again, this is predicting the image class given the image and the prior, we see a pretty significant jump. You know, so in computer vision, in our papers, we're often fighting for like 1 or 2% improvements in performance. And here we're seeing like nearly a 10% improvement by leveraging this additional information, which I think is kind of a pretty satisfying thing to be able to show. And so again, what I'm just showing here is these are all different ways in which you could also make use of that information, that prior location information. And actually, in practice, they don't do nearly as well as the approach that we advocated here, which is these two distinct neural networks, one for species classification from images, one for spatial temporal prior modeling, and combining them together. Okay, and so the fun thing about this is, so I mentioned at the very start, this, for example, iNaturalist 2021 data set. What I didn't say is that every year when we've kind of, the years that we've released these data sets, we've also released competitions on Kaggle. So again, many of you know Kaggle. Kaggle is kind of like a data science competition platform, where you kind of put up a task and you have different teams that take part, and they try and do well on that task. So it might be an image classification task, and they will attempt to try and get high classification performance or low error. And so many of the top teams that performed that competed in the 2021 classification task on Anatrast, they all made use of this location information in some form. They are much more sophisticated and newer models than the simple ones we looked at in that older paper. But they saw a huge boost even from these kind of latest vision models from incorporating this information. And what kind of blows my mind, and I think this, when we saw these numbers at the time, we were kind of like, this is, yeah, incredibly impressive how well these teams, how well their models worked, was that they were getting 95% top, is it top 3? I think I'd have to look up what the metric is again. But basically, 95% of the time, they were getting the right answer in the top 3 of the classes, which is which is incredibly impressive. I'd have to caveat that I have to double check if that's top 3 or top 1. Either way, it's it's a very impressive score on these 10,000 way classification tasks. Okay, and so just to give you another flavor as to what is kind of interesting to me about these models and what's potentially exciting is that we're talking about learning representations of species, learning representations of locations, and even actually representations of the people that take photographs of these things. And so we can think of them then all existing in this kind of common or shared embedding space. And so if people have heard of things like PCA or TS&E or these dimensionality reduction techniques, you could think of this visualization I'm showing as kind of this low dimensional representation of people and locations. And if we think of these things existing in the shared space, when there's kind of like a proximity or when things are near each other, it tells you something about their affinity for each other. So if I have a species here in this green triangle and it's close to this location embedding here, this blue one, and it tells me that there's a high affinity for those two things, and in practice, there's a higher likelihood or high likelihood that species will actually be present. So we get this kind of quite cool and interesting lower dimensional interpretable representation of these different components for our model. And I'll show you a few kind of visualizations of that in a minute. So, like I said here, we could embed location and get a representation for that, and we can kind of visualize what those features look like. So in practice, this is a really high dimensional feature vector, and we're just projecting it into kind of RGB colors, and we can see that there's some kind of coarse regional information that pops out of this, and there's clearly like different colors for different parts of North America, for example, kind of indicating that different species are likely to be supported by those different locations, which makes sense. And then for the other thing we get for our model is we can just literally back out a distribution of where the model thinks that a given species might be present. So for the species here, this heat map here, the dark color tells us where this model, it tells us the prediction of the model of whether it thinks that species is actually likely to be present at that location. So again, what this is saying is that when the color is really dark, it means that there's a very high probability that from the model that the species is there. And when it's very white, or there's no color, this tells us that the model thinks it's not present. And so you can think that when you combine that with your vision model, if I've taken an image, up here somewhere in Europe, and the vision model is very confident that it's this species, this prior will actually kind of ground it in some sense and bring it down to earth and say, well, you know what? According to my prediction, the species is actually only present in West Africa, and so it's very likely that you've made a mistake and you're saying the wrong thing. So this is kind of a way to visualize these predictions. And again, here's another example. This might be kind of quite small, and so it's not necessary to take in exactly the distributions here, but it's just an attempt to show you that we can also do things like vary time. So each column is a different time point, a different time during the year, and we can have the model predict different species distributions at different points in time. And again, each row is a different species here. So for example, we have this wood thrush, and we see some kind of migratory behavior exhibited in the model that's kind of learned from the data itself. And okay, so I should definitely kind of caveat that, saying this is like far from perfect, and this is not the quality or the rigor of distribution model that you would want for an ecological assessment. The way that we worked on this problem was from the point of view of like, how can we improve computer vision? How can we make computer vision better? And in that setting, actually, you might quite like to have these kind of overly blurry and smooth predictions because they have a good kind of regularizer as opposed to having something very precise and sharp. Okay, and then we can do stuff like we can, again, think of this in terms of this representation we learn of species. Each of these dots here represents one of 5,000 different species that we've embedded in the, or we've learned features for, and we've embedded in this low dimensional space. And then we can kind of back out from this space and we can visualize the distributions. And so what we see is two species that are close to each other in this low dimensional space have a very similar spatial distribution, which again is kind of intuitive, it makes sense. But again, you kind of, the model allows you to kind of discover the structure that potentially is present in there and extract it out. Okay, so I'm going to pause on this this kind of topic, and I know I haven't given you a lot of details on how you would actually go about this, but my hope is just to provide a bit of insight and intuition as to how you can make use of this extra kind of information to improve the kind of classification models that we use now. But I can stop and take any questions on this particular part if there are any.
Yeah, Brian. I'll just repeat it.
Okay. What kind of vacant count things like zoos, for example, or things where animals shouldn't be, or if it's like an article picture, like.
So Brian has a very good question. He's asking, how do you take into account things like zoos or people's pets, things where there's an animal where it maybe isn't, it shouldn't be? Yeah,
that's a good question. So I think that this is also a big problem for iNaturalist. So one thing I think what happens a lot is people, they download the iNaturalist app and then they, they find, well, people don't have magazines anymore, but they pull up the first picture of a tiger they find on a book on their desk and they take a photograph of it. And the vision model says, yes, that's definitely a tiger. But in, knowing where you physically were would tell you that that's probably not very likely. But like you say, what if you're at a zoo, or what if you see like a really unusual migratory event that happened where something really isn't where it should be? So the prior is likely to really discount that heavily, and it's going to say, look, this is not this is not likely to be realistic. The flip side of that, I think, is if you did want to model those types of events, I guess you'd have to give the network a lot more capacity or a lot more ability to kind of really memorize effectively those kind of very unusual physical locations that actually do tend to support these types of unusual presences of species.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Oisin, but doesn't iNat actually have like geofences around zoos where they basically, if they're building like some sort of model using iNat data, they'll just explicitly filter out anything from a zoo?
Yeah, I mean, there's also kind of general instructions that, you're not supposed to have cultivated species, you're not supposed to have things that are in captivity. So there's supposed to be kind of good user behavior involved as well. But I think that the higher level question still is a good one in terms of like unusual outliers and so on, and whether models can actually capture those.
And we talked a little bit a different day about how as the climate is changing, species migration patterns are also changing. And so in this case, sort of you're looking from the past, but actually the future might be different. And so figuring out how to handle the fact that birds are migrating earlier, for example, is also interesting.
Yeah, and so, again, in a very hand-wavy way, you can imagine thinking about things in these kinds of in these kind of low-dimensional spaces. You could think about the trajectory of a point, like over time. If we had that kind of richness of observation, we'd see maybe some species moving a bit in this space, and that would be reflected in its distribution actually changing it. So there might be some cool ecological insight that could be derived from better versions of models like this.
Ethan, you had a question?
Yeah, so kind of based on anecdotal evidence, but I was wondering, like, so you guys have these priors for like space, time, and location, and I was wondering if like when it comes down to the purely just like inference task, the priors for like individual observers, just knowing, I don't know, knowing about the ecologists, I know people who like literally only care about birds.
So they're all asking really good questions. Ethan was asking, just based on anecdotal evidence and based on the ecologists he knows, you have these priors built in for space and time. Do you also think about priors for individual observers because he knows ecologists that only take pictures of birds?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I only super briefly touched on it here, but in practice, we explored a variant of this model where we also embedded people inside of this same embedding space. Because you can think of it the same way, like people have a affinity for particular locations, and they also have affinity for types of species. We didn't go really far down this route, but I think there's a lot that could be done in terms of like understanding, what it is you're likely to have observed given your interests in certain types of things, and what is it that you're likely to have ignored. I think the reason that gets complicated is then there's these like kind of unusual observation patterns, which is that like you might be really excited to take the first photograph of a species that you've never seen before, never recorded on iNaturalist, and then you kind of lose interest for the second one. So I think that some of these things will kind of break under some of these unusual behaviors that people exhibit in practice.
For example, I get really excited when I travel and do a lot more INAT observations, but those are probably not representative of where I actually live.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's a cool direction though. I think if we had more data, when more data starts coming online, you could really start thinking of doing stuff like that more.
Rachel?
My question is, unless this is an oversimplified model, is this location and time right now, that part of it? And I wonder, and with such a huge improvement by incorporating location and time, are they thinking of, are there other things that you could add that would see more improvement? Like, what if you just put elevation in there?
So Rachel was curious, currently you're looking at place and time. And she's curious if you actually might see additional improvement by adding additional information, for example, something like elevation.
Yeah, really good question. So there's two probably answers to that. So one is a very simple one, which is we were really interested in having a model that was very easy to deploy. So this model that that we have ultimately, it's basically a neural network that only needs to have these three pieces of information to give you an output. So any mobile phone or cell phone would be able to give you those pieces of information. If you had to start storing like rasterized environmental covariates at high resolution, that's going to be kind of non-trivial space required on a phone, for example. So that's the kind of the computer science answer. I think the other answer to this is that that information is likely to be very useful. The hope would be that you learn something about those particular properties just through like sheer data, in the sense that if there is some sets of species that tend to that habitat is kind of whatever, a marshland, you're going to be seeing those observations, and so in some sense the underlying representation you have of that place should hopefully pick up on those characteristics. And I think we're explicitly providing to that model, those to the model would help us when you're in kind of low data regimes where you have like an unusual location where there's not much stuff, not many observations, not unusual, sorry, but a place where people don't go, where you don't have much data, and that's where maybe you would benefit from having that stuff in there, explicitly. So you can just put it as extra inputs basically to the model. But
then you have to figure out, then you can only use it if you have that information. So yeah. Okay, cool. I think we're gonna move on for now, and then we'll have some.
I'll need more time at the end to talk as well. But yeah, thanks for the questions. Okay, so the takeaways there. Okay, so what are the takeaways? So the INAT, like I say, is a kind of, I think in some sense it's an extreme case of when you have a lot of data. Crucially, that's very diverse. So this is data from lots of different people. It's not just data from just one person. It's lots of different data. But we have image classification models that can do incredibly well on these types of tasks. Not perfect by any means, but certainly very impressive. But using this additional information, this additional context, can help you even more. So I think there's maybe a very obvious kind of insight here that there's often extra information you can bring to the problem that isn't easily embeddable into your computer vision models that can really help you do better. And so being able to think about that, I think, is a useful thing to be able to do. Okay, so like I say, however, this is not a solved problem. So here's a nice figure from actually a paper from Sarah. So there's, in practice, this is what the world maybe looks like on iNaturalist. We get these nice colorful photos of different species, or sorry, of the same species, different depictors of them. But if you stick a camera trap out there, you're going to get, tail photos and weird body parts and, misdetections and so on. So this domain gap, which I think as humans we're actually quite good at traversing, these models are not capable of learning on kind of high quality data and generalizing to poor quality data. So this is just a problem that we have. Another problem is the relationship between performance and amount of training data. So this is, again, an older figure, but it still, I think, broadly holds in that the vertical axis is test accuracy, and the horizontal axis, so this looks a bit busier, but the way to think of this is that as we go from left to right, we have more example images for each of the classes at training time. So if I take an example here, it means this is the average, or the average test performance is this orange line of all the species that have 5 to 10 examples at training time. And if I go all the way up to the extreme, this is the average performance of all the species that have between 2,000 and 4,000 images at training time. And so what you see is that there's certainly a decrease in performance when you have less data per species, but there's also a saturating effect here, where the more data you have after a certain amount, in this case, it doesn't give you significantly better performance. But the takeaway here really is that, an obvious one, that amount of data is important for these deep networks, amount of supervised data, and less data is going to mean models, or less data for classes is going to result in less quality predictions. Okay, so let me just very quickly skim through this. So I apologize that I'm not going to give you any details on this next part, but I'll just kind of give you some high level kind of takeaways from another project that we worked on. So in practice, we're in this regime where we had limited supervision. So that might mean that we have very few examples where we know what's in the image. We just maybe have the images themselves. So we haven't been able to spend the time or the efforts to actually annotate all those images. And all we have instead is, lots of images, but actually no supervision of what's there. This is a nice kind of, I think, characterization of the problem by a figure from Eli. But basically, if we think of supervised learning, so this is the kind of standard paradigm. We have images, we have some models. So let's say the blue part is our model, and their image makes a prediction about the Y or the class label. And in training time, we have some loss functions that we use to basically minimize the difference between the observed ground truth labels, the Ys, and the predicteds. And so, you can think a good model is one that does well on the training set. So the predictions, the Y predictions, are similar to the ground truth. And we can apply this paradigm, this is the kind of conventional paradigm, and this is an example here from a camera trap data set. So this is from Omiris, who's a PhD student I work with, and he's working in UCL at Kate Jones's lab, and they're basically trying to do animal prediction or animal classification in camera trap images. And so what we observe here is this is data from the Masai Mara. We've got 20,000 or 20 species, and when we give the model just 1% of this data, so the 1% of the 10,000 training examples, we get performance, less than 50%. And the more data we give it, the kind of performance improves further. And so this is the kind of supervised paradigm. But in practice, we don't have, this 10,000 label examples. We only actually have the 1,000. And so this is kind of telling us that, okay, when we've only got, 100, 1,000 examples, we get pretty poor performance. And so there's another paradigm, and this is kind of a paradigm that's being explored heavily of late in research, and that is of self-supervised learning. So in self-supervised learning, we don't have an actual Y. We don't have a ground truth Y label. What we have instead is just the data X itself. And the way to frame the self-supervised problem is that we basically derive some kind of training signal from just the data. And again, I'm saying this in a very kind of high level way, but the key takeaway is that we don't have labels, but instead we're going to try and come up with some signal from the actual raw data itself, and we're going to use that to update the parameters of the model. And this is still a way in which we can learn some representation from our images, even if we haven't explicitly got that supervision to work with. And if you take kind of off-the-shelf self-supervised methods, and some of you might have even heard of things like SimCLR or SimClear, they actually already do, a lot better. So this is kind of nearly a 10% improvement on this classification task at varying amounts of supervision. what Emiris was looking at was basically, again, trying to understand if you used priors about when and where images were captured, even if you didn't know what was actually in the images, would you be able to kind of integrate that information into some kind of signal that you could use to train your model? So training your image classifiers without any actual labels to come up with some representation that you can then use for classification. And in doing that, he was basically able to get this kind of even further improvement in performance. So again, we're talking about nearly a 20% overall top one classification performance improvement from thinking hard and thinking about how you would learn the representations in the first place. So again, I've skimmed through that, but the kind of maybe takeaway here is that there are new approaches that exist to deal with this limited supervised data regime. However, you still need, a relatively large amount of unlabeled data. So you still need lots of the diverse data to train on, but you can do a lot more now than you could without having the labels. And there's an asterisk here because the asterisk is kind of saying, look, in practice, this is not a silver bullet. This is still an open area of research, and there's still many things that are kind of not well understood about the kind of self-supervised problem and under what settings it actually works well. Okay, so I've got maybe about 4 or 5 more minutes of slides, and then I'll stop. And so maybe I wanted to spend a few minutes on just talking about the next steps on where we can go in terms of ecology helping computer vision. And so an obvious one is that of beyond images, so multimodal data. So I mean things like audio, I mean things like video. And so, for example, with Grant and Rui and a few others at Cornell, we've been exploring the building of data sets that are kind of audio-visual. So we've got video, we've got audio, we've got images, and these are, in this case, all representing birds. So it's a data set called the Sapsucker Woods 60 data set, which is 60 species of birds that are found in the east coast of the US. And so why this is kind of interesting and fun is that there's kind of complementary information in images and in audio. So what I'm showing here is there's kind of 2 pairs of species. So we've got these 2, a crow and a raven, and the actual visual classification task is quite hard for a crow and a raven. But below we've got spectrogram. So this is a kind of a visual way of representing the audio. And apparently it's much easier to be able to distinguish between the 2 from listening to their calls. Okay, so in some sense, the audio ID problem is a lot easier than the image one. If we flip it around and look at a different example, so these 2 warblers, visually they're very distinct, but actually in audio-wise, they are much more hard to separate. And so there's this kind of like a complementary signal that could be used to be able to help us improve either of those domains. And again, not so important maybe for this talk, but we have this new data set where we've got audio, we've got video, and we've got on the order of kind of thousands of examples and training and test sets for this. And this is kind of like, I think, a first step in this direction. This is nothing like the scale of the iNaturalist data sets, but it's a first step to get there. Okay, and so the last thing I wanted to flag was another piece of work that we did a few years ago, which I think, again, or maybe last year, which has kind of a huge potential for further expansion and to think about it. So, on something like iNaturalist, one problem is just cataloging the images, saying what species are there. But the next level of problems is like turning that repository into something useful for ecologists, for biologists, conservation scientists, to be able to extract interesting insights and observations from. And so this, I think, is a really fun example. This is a example from a guy called Greg Pauly, I think at the Natural History Museum in LA, and he was interested in the mating behavior of the southern alligator lizards. And so he's kind of an expert on these species, but had never seen this happen in real life, I guess, or never seen their kind of weird mating behavior. And through iNaturalist, they were able to kind of look through the kind of observations. So these red dots are the locations where those species are observed, and they've been able to find, on the order of 150 of these observations of this kind of mating behavior happening, whereas in the previous records there was only 3 there. So you could kind of think like, what would a system look like that would support someone like Greg or someone along those lines who once wakes up with a kind of question in their mind about like, show me all the images of X doing Y, or all the images of X and Y together, and so on. Like, so this goes beyond classification and into this kind of richer set of tasks that one would like to do. And so we took a first stab in that direction by kind of constructing this new set of tasks called this natural world evaluation tasks, where we have a kind of a benchmark to allow us to understand how good computer vision representations or features are at doing things like a species ID, which is the usual one, but things related to the appearance, related to the health, the age, you know, something about the context of the environment that something is in, something about the behavior. And so these kind of go beyond just the conventional classification task and try to construct this suite of tasks that people can try and work on. And so, for example, there's 164 tasks, and an example might be mating alligator lizard, like I said, or we have a raptor or bird on a utility pole, or is it in a bird in a hand, and so on. So there's these kind of embedded inside of this data set is all these like mini tasks. And the idea would be that you'd like to develop general purpose models that are able to do these kinds of things with very little supervision. Okay, so this is not important, but this gives you this would give you a sense of how well different models are performing. And we see that they can do well on certain things, but actually quite poorly on others. So again, I'll gloss over that. Okay, so that is pretty much the end of the talk. I think from my perspective, these natural world derived data sets and challenges, they help push the limits of computer vision and machine learning, and that's what's really exciting about it. And then hopefully the resulting improvements can drive scientific insight and discoveries in domains like ecology. And I think that's where we need people at the interface, like people here today in the room, who can kind of understand what computer vision is capable of doing and push people to help us kind of drive the state of the art even further and open up new problems that were not possible before. So yeah, big thanks to all the people here, Grant, who's on all of the projects, Eli, Omiros, and Pietro, and Serge as well. And then there's also many other people like Sarah and Kimi Wilbur at Google and so on, who I haven't listed, but have been kind of instrumental in many of these projects as well. Okay, so yeah, and so in the last slide or two, so like Sarah said, I'm based at the University of Edinburgh, and there's a kind of a larger computer vision group there of people, and so you can kind of check out our websites to learn a bit more about that. And I have my contact details here at the end, in case people want to shoot me an email, or you can, I don't really post on Twitter, but you can have a look on Twitter and follow me and so on. I'd be very eager to hear from you if you have any questions or follow-up.
Thank you so much, Oisin. Yeah, so what other questions do people have? Anyone?
Sarah, I'm here. It's Ben. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Oisin, I'm here. I snuck in on Sarah's Zoom meeting. So I have a couple questions that relate to how you sort of see this moving forward. So with iNaturalist and LifeClef and all these other really big data sets, where we're starting to get to the point where a traditional paradigm of like a single flat softmax layer is getting somewhat absurd, right? Like we have like we're going to predict 20,000 classes or 50, or there's 9,000 birds on Earth, or, and so like, what is it that you start to see us moving towards? Is it nested hierarchical structures? Is it mixture of experts? How do we start to think about not every researcher developing their model based on, grants data or something, and moving towards a more general thing that might exist that could translate across these different structures? What kind of either architecture or workflow do you sort of see happening?
Okay, and just one second, just for context for all the people in this room, that's Ben Weinstein, who's giving a talk next week.
Hi, sorry.
Okay, so great question, Ben. Yeah, so I think there's probably two parts to that. So one of them is kind of like the scaling question of, can the paradigms we have right now scale to, what did I say at the start, like 200,000 species or maybe even 300,000
Right,
species?
it gets crazy.
Definitely gets crazy, yeah. And so I think that there's probably very pragmatic engineering type things that you could do. Like you said, you could make hierarchical predictions. You could have ways of just reducing the computation, and I think that problem could be addressed. I think that the thing maybe that I always take away from this is that the advances that we often see is it's literally like, it's kind of off-the-shelf components or parts that are working well in other vision tasks. They tend to kind of, work well in these types of domains as well. So there doesn't seem to be a need for reinventing the wheel. And I think that maybe the way I would think about it is that we can use these kind of models as a starting point where, maybe you do need to kind of tune it or adapt it to your particular, topic or your particular set of species, your particular question. really you should probably be thinking about how can I leverage these big, huge models that we don't necessarily train, every week, we train every year, every half a year, and we leverage this kind of rich representation that's contained inside of those. So yeah, I think I'm probably more for consolidating things into single models or sets of models rather than everyone trying to do very different things, because I think that you leverage the effort of more people, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Good question though. Yeah.
I've got one more, but I'll wait, see if anyone else has anything else.
Does anyone else have a question? Yep. Roni, did you have one?
I was wondering how to validate millions of photos. Like, I thought that it was just the general public, taking photos, uploading them. But how do you know that a photo is good? Like, why? Because eventually you're training the whole, like, everything on this data set, and like, how do you tackle such a huge thing?
So Roni was asking, basically, how do we validate the data itself that's coming in from iNaturalist? So there's millions and millions of photos. It's just people going out into the community and taking a picture. How do you know that you can trust that data? And how do you, what are the choices that you make in terms of validation?
Yeah, I think, again, it's a good insight. I think the reality is that you can't do that very well at scale. If you could put the time and effort in, maybe you could kind of hire experts and go through and actually kind of create a gold standard subset of the data set, and you could get a sense of, like, does my performance on the iNat test set, does that kind of track well this gold standard, which I really trust? I think that, these deep models, they're able to deal with some element of noise. And so there's some element of mislabelings or mistakes that are happening. If there's consistent kind of some biases that are happening inside of things, like common confusions that are happening, they're not going to be able to resolve those. But the kind of, like, if someone's made a mistake or the community has reached a consensus which is not the right one, they can deal with those kinds of things. And again, I think where it gets misleading is when the test sets then become highly biased and influenced by that behavior. That's when you really have a kind of an inaccurate perspective on how well your model is doing. So I agree that it's a big problem. It could be a problem. I think iNaturalists have looked into it a bit, but my sense is that there's an element of robustness that these models are capable of out of the box, and I think it would only be a significant worry if you really thought going forward, like maybe the vision models could propagate error even more, or they could bias the community. So I think there's just kind of design decisions that would have to be kind of made in how you collect annotations to really mitigate those issues.
So she asked if the test set, for example, is being monitored more than the training.
So can you say the last word again? What more than the training?
Is it being like monitored or vetted better than the training?
Yeah, so what we did one year, in the first year of it, we actually had people go through and put boxes around the items in the test set. And so the idea was we were able to filter out things that were like, evidence of, like, feces or whatever, hoof mark or something like that. And so there was an element of that. I don't think that really gave us a much more reliable signal than actually just not doing it. And at a certain point, the scale meant that it wasn't feasible or easy to do that. So the short answer is no, but what we do is that we ensure that we try to create fair splits in training and tests. So what we do, things like, we make sure that the same person who's we make sure the observations from a person for a given species don't appear in both training and test site, because maybe I take like 1,000 photographs of a Eurasian blackbird or something, and it heavily biases the data set. So we limit the amount of observations per person, and we don't let those observations go in, we don't let observations from a person for a species go in both sets. And that gives us a kind of a better sense of generalization, because we're not kind of memorizing things.
For example, I might really like to take pictures of bugs at a certain angle, and I might really like a certain type of bug. And so then there could be that type of data poisoning that we talked about the other day, coming actually from those human behavioral biases.
Yeah, this is a huge issue, I think, for when people start curating their own data sets. You have to kind of really think through how to do that. And sometimes it can feel suboptimal, because you kind of feel like, oh, I'm sacrificing training data to make a fair test set. But it's really the only way you can kind of get a robust sense of, like, is my model actually working, or is it just learning some shortcut that isn't really representative of the thing I care about.
And I think another important point with INAT is that these they're only training the models on observations that become research grade. And in order to become research grade, they need to have community consensus on the identification of the species. So a person uploads a picture, they say, I think it's this, and then they need to actually have other members of the community confirm that identification before it becomes research grade. So there is a community vetting process. Now, I don't know anything about identifying slime mold, and I could go on there and just be like, yep, I agree. So like, there's this sense of, you might also want to vet the community. And I know Grant Van Horn has looked a little bit into that. Like, are there ways that you can actually also model expertise? Ben, you had one more question?
Yeah, so I think it's important for the students in the room and people in different parts of their career. It's sort of a theory of research or philosophy of science question, which is that one of the challenges with the intersection between ecology and computer vision is that some of the things that are driving computer vision can kind of come in waves. Things kind of go in vogue, or they become hot, or in some way sort of capture the imagination of the community. And for ecologists, it can be hard because you sort of start seeing this onslaught of a certain thing. Transformers or self-supervision, or whatever it is. So I'm wondering from your perspective, how you think about the kinds of research programs and questions you ask, and how you kind of avoid the sort of posturing or other sort of waves of research that come out of computer vision, and you evaluate kind of where you're going to go and what kind of questions you're going to ask.
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so what's a good way to think about it? I think there's probably, again, one or two ways to think about it from my perspective, and I would also be interested to hear what others think as well, so people should chime in on that question as well. I think that there's a pragmatic version of this, which is the advances that we make in computer vision, while they are pretty significant year on year, they might translate to relatively small improvements on a given domain. And in practice, actually just collecting more training data would give you more results than switching to a big transformer from a CNN. And so if you only care about your problem and you want to get better at your problem, you could probably ignore some of those kinds of the latest fads that come along. The other side of this is if you want to publish in computer vision and machine learning, those domains and what's kind of interest to that community is methodological advancement. So it's not really about the data sets themselves, unless those data sets can inform questions that were not possible to answer already. So I think that's why publishing at the intersection can be quite difficult, because you're trying to satisfy two different groups of people who have slightly different and opposing views of each other. So I think that there's like there has to be just some kind of like balancing act where you find the way to like bring these types of problems into vision, and then obviously if you're an ecologist or a domain expert, you just can kind of greedily grab what's out there and take the best of what's available and apply it to your problem. I think that there's I don't know if I have a more nuanced perspective than probably just that very basic observation.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way. Like it's not like, oh yeah, okay, the perfect thing to do is just X. I feel like I'm always teetering back and forth on this balance beam a little bit of like more impactful, like more relevant to ecology, further away from what computer vision researchers might care about. And then going back the other way and like developing something that's more methodological, maybe more computer vision interesting, but potentially less immediately usable or useful for ecologists. So like, I don't know, I will be navigating this my whole life. And I think many of you probably will as well, one way or another. And I guess, I think the one thing that Ben was getting at that I completely agree with is that it is good to start to learn a healthy amount of skepticism for like the hype claims that people have in machine learning papers, or like seeing, everyone get really excited about. So this year it was a NERF. It was like these 3D models of like the environment that you could move around with, and you could interpolate between different views. And so you would take a few input views and then get this 3D model, and like looks really cool. So many people are working on NERF. Is that something that's going to be immediately useful for ecology? Maybe, but maybe not. And sometimes it can actually be good to just wait a year or two and see like what people still use.
Yeah, I mean, I think self-supervision in particular is so attractive to us because so many of us are going to have very large unlabeled data sets. I was in a meeting that Sarah was in maybe a week ago, 2 weeks ago, talking to sea otter people flying over a massive area in Southeast Alaska, but no clear vision about like annotation strategy. And so you just have this massive unlabeled area. So self-supervision suddenly becomes very attractive, but it's never obvious, how far we should dip our toes into such things and when it's posturing and sort of hype versus no, this really is the next thing. And that's a very difficult thing that I think everyone in the room is going to have to sort of grapple with, is that these things kind of come in waves a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think like there's a few things there, and I think oftentimes people can engage in data collection endeavors and they neglect the annotation component, which is basically the only thing that makes the machine learning models work. And so that really has to be kind of factored highly. You can also kind of easily get influenced by big claims and promises that stuff, works really well without supervision, when in practice it doesn't. It's clear that that kind of direction, though, is one which kind of machine learning and computer vision are going to be, pursuing for many years forward. So the hope will be that we will get better at those tasks and that stuff will translate over. But it's it's not the case that it's available and ready to go now, and that's something that people should be aware of, definitely.
Yeah.
And this is also something we're going to be trying to tackle a little bit in these reading groups, is like when you're reading these papers, we're going to try to understand like, okay, these are their claims. It sounds really good and we can look at their results, but like, can we figure out what they're not telling us? Can we figure out if like the improvements they're talking about are actually kind of significant enough to make it worth the investment to try this new model? Like, how do you make those decisions for yourself? Because of course, everyone is being a salesman.
Yeah, for sure.
I think this is maybe slightly deviating from what we said, but I realized I kind of didn't mention this, and I think it's an important point that, one of the things that makes INET work is the fact that it is lots of data available from lots of people under a very permissive license. In reality, it's, the reality is more complex for each person's problem of interest. It might be that there's protected species, or it might be that there's like funding restrictions around data usage and data sharing, but getting data out there in other people's hands, maybe after you've done the kind of core science that you need to do, but making stuff available, it's the best way to kind of help allow others to make progress on your problem with you. And especially if your problem elicits a kind of a new challenge that is not just kind of maybe like more conventional classification tasks, even though there's nothing wrong with that, and that those can be challenging in their own right. But if you can kind of like, excite people in these other communities because of the nature of your task, that's a great way to get kind of more progress as well on your problem of interest.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe one more question from the audience, and then we're already 12 minutes over, so we're taking a lot of Oisin's time, but thank you so much. Yeah, one more question. Yeah. So Oisin, Tiziana was asking if the code for the iNaturalist model is in GitHub.
Yeah, so we have a few different things. I think we have some pre-trained models from various snapshots of from various instances over the year. I don't think there is like the pre-trained model that the iNaturalist team themselves use. So their computer vision model is not used, so is not available. What is available is models that we have, for example, that we trained on the 17 data set or the 18 data set or the 21 data set. And so yeah, that is available if that's what you mean.
Yeah, there's a follow-up. Yeah. So she actually really wants to know, is your GeoPrior code available?
Yes, that is available. So if you go to my website, and you'll find the link basically to that project. And there's even like actually a little demo. It's not live at the moment, but there's a demo. You can download the code and you can run it, and you can actually just type in the name of a species, and if that species is in the model, then it will generate the distribution for you and so on. So yeah, that's definitely available. It's just PyTorch, NumPy, nothing too exotic.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, let's thank Oisin again, and yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your time at Caltech.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Oisin.